Welcome to Tuesday's edition of our podcast. We're studying through the book of 2 Corinthians, and we're in the 11th chapter, we're going to pick up with verse number 31 again. The Apostle Paul has made this statement, I'm going to boast in my weaknesses. In other words, I'm going to lift up. The word boast means to lift up my weaknesses. I want you to understand my weaknesses. And by the way, the Apostle Paul had weaknesses in persecution, but he also had a weakness called the concern for the church. But now in verse number 31, he says this. He says, God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. In other words, he's calling God out as a witness. A witness to what? To his strengths, to his great evangelistic crusades, to all the healings that he's brought to people's lives. No, he's calling God as a witness to his weaknesses. And then he tells a story in verse number 32. And this is the story. In Damascus, the etharch, under Artis, the king, was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. Now, this goes back several years in time. And he tells this story that this king, that he's guarding the city of Damascus, and he's guarding the city of Damascus for the purpose of killing and seizing the Apostle Paul. This happened in 39 to 40 A.D., somewhere in that vicinity. Paul is young in his faith. The city of Damascus is in the area of Syria, and the king is guarding the city. You can find this story actually in the book of Acts, the 9th chapter. They wanted to put Paul to death. They wanted to seize Paul and put him to death. Verse number 24 says their plot, and again I'm reading out of Acts 9, it says their plot became known to Saul, and they were watching the gates in the day and the night so that they might put him to death. They wanted to kill Paul. And so the king sets up guards around the city. And they want to seize Paul and they want to kill him. Well, back in those days, the city had huge walls. And the only way in and out was through the gates, supposedly. Well, what happens? Verse number 25 again of Acts 9. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a large basket. Now, why is Paul talking about this? Because the Apostle Paul sees this as a weakness. He sees his leaving the city of Damascus as a weakness. Now, we could say, well, should he have stayed and been killed? Not necessarily. Should he have stayed and been in prison? That's not necessarily what he's saying, but he's saying, you know what, I had a need. I had a need, and I needed to do something in order to save my life, in order to save my ministry. But he said, I was in need. God is my witness that I had a weakness. And he said, you know what? I had to flee Damascus. I had to leave Damascus. So Paul says again, he says, I'm going to boast in my weaknesses. I'm going to boast in the fact that I needed to leave Damascus. You know, I've got many missionary friends, and some of them are in countries that it's against the law to preach the gospel. And they say to me, you know, I can either stay and die or I can flee and continue the ministry. Well, Paul, in this instance, fled in order to continue the ministry. We wouldn't have the books that Paul wrote without him fleeing Damascus. But Paul saw that as a weakness. Now, that whole theme carries on into chapter 12. And chapter 12, verse 1 says this: boasting is necessary, though it is not profitable, for I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. What's Paul saying? Boasting is necessary. I need to boast. But then again, remember what he was talking about. You know, I don't know why they put the chapter divisions. They didn't ask my permission. They didn't need to ask my permission. But I don't know why they put chapter 1 in chapter 12 and didn't include it in chapter 11. What's he talking about? He said boasting is necessary. What's he boasting on? He's boasting on his weaknesses. He's telling people, he's lifting up what he's done. That's the word boasting means, to lift up. But now he goes on and he says, boasting is necessary, though it is not profitable. In other words, boasting doesn't always bring gain to someone. And then he goes on, he says, but I will go on to visions and revelation. Now, what's Paul doing? Well, we need to understand that the Corinthian people loved visions, and they loved revelations, and they loved all of this stuff. They had an insatiable desire, even a lust for knowledge and for visions, and people would stand on the corner and they would make up things, and they would say, I had this vision. And so Paul is saying, you know what, hey, you know, I've been boasting in my weaknesses, but I just want to remind you that I've had revelations and I've had visions. So what's Paul doing? Paul is going on and he's saying, you know what? I know what I'm talking about when I talk about revelations and visions. Paul is moving past his boasting on weaknesses, and he's beginning to go into talking about a vision that he had. Now, the word for vision means an act of exhibiting oneself to view. This Greek word, and it means, a vision means being placed in a place where you begin to view something, where you begin to see something. I remember having a vision. I was in a prayer meeting. All of a sudden, I was caught up in a vision, and God called me to the ministry. It was very real. But you know what? I saw things. I saw nations coming to me, and Jesus handing me a gift. And you know what? That's when Paul says a vision, he is talking about that he actually, on the inside of him, saw something happening. And the Greek word for revelation means a disclosure. This vision, Paul saw something, and in this vision that we're going to talk about tomorrow, God began to disclose to the Apostle Paul some absolutely amazing things. So you're going to have to join us again tomorrow, because we're going to talk about Paul's vision. Thank you for watching.